Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 2, the literature review. Just a couple of things before we get started. I want to draw your attention to what our co-host Sierra has posted in the chat box. You will get this recording and slide deck will be sent to your email 24 to 48 hours after the webinar. There's also some helpful links on here. One is to schedule a consultation just to see what we offer, to see if that's right for you. There's no obligation. A couple more links to on our website. We have resources, chapter guides, blogs, helpful information, and also other webinars are archived on our website, so you can access those as well. Also, before we get started, I just want to scroll to the end here. This is our contact information. And again, we encourage you, if you just want to find out more about what we offer, see if that's right for what you need, feel free to schedule a consultation. Free, no obligation, just to see, again, if what we offer is would work for you. Okay, so let's get started. This is the chapter 2, the literature review. And our model of the dissertation is based on the typical, it's fairly typical. There are other models, but the 5-chapter model, where chapter 1 is the introduction, chapter 2 is literature review, chapter 3 is the methods chapter, where you outline your methods. Chapter 4 is your results, where you present your results. And chapter 5 is the discussion, where you discuss and analyze your results. Okay, so the lit review, here's what we're going to cover today. But let's just kind of pull back for a minute from the sections that we're going to kind of talk about in depth, just to kind of think about, what the chapter 2 is and its purpose. The chapter 2 is the literature review. And yes, it contains a review of the literature on your topic. You want to, but basically, the purpose is kind of twofold. I mean, it's not only to kind of act as a context for your study. Here's the research that's been conducted on the topic, but it's also kind of an argument for your research problem. It culminates into an argument for why you're conducting your study. So as you review the literature on your topic, you're reviewing it. There is some summary, but there's some analysis too, some synthesis, and you want to highlight what's in the literature, but also we want to highlight what's not in the literature. In other words, what your study is designed to do, right? Because your study should be unique in some way. It should have a unique angle. If research has already been conducted in a certain area on a certain topic from a certain point of view, then we don't need it anymore, really, right? It's already been done. So your study is designed to be unique in some way. It may use a different theory, or come at something from a different perspective, or address a gap in the literature or something. So part of what the literature review does is, in reviewing the literature and the research, you want to keep in mind any opportunity that you can make a case for your study, right? So here's what we're looking at in the literature. Here's what's been conducted on my topic. But always keep in mind that you're always trying to highlight what's not in the literature, and hence the need for your study. Okay, so let's just kind of keep that in mind as we go along. Also, the literature review is challenging because usually it's long. If you haven't already, you should obtain your school's template or guidelines. Most schools have them, some schools don't. And if your school doesn't have a template or guideline for the chapters and the dissertation, see if you can get an example, right? And get an example anyway, even if you do have a template. It's always helpful to have an example that's kind of close to what you're doing, an approved dissertation from your school, just to see how people have handled some of these sections and some of these chapters. But it's especially important, of course, if you don't have a template or guidelines. Some schools have length requirements, some schools don't. What's the typical length of a lit review? I've seen 10-page lit reviews, I've seen 80-page lit reviews, but the sweet spot seems to be about 25 or 30 pages. Give or take, but that's usually what they fall in, 25 to 30 pages. Okay, and they're challenging because they're long, but you're gonna have a lot of content, right? You're gonna have a lot of material. So really, one of the big challenges for the lit review is organization, right? Because you're gonna have to a lot of research. How do you organize it, right? What do you do with it all? Okay, so we're gonna get we're going to touch on that as we go through it. And the organizational strategy is not going to be any kind of secret, right? Because it's going to align with what you're actually studying, right? So if you're studying 3 different factors or constructs or variables, your literature review is going to focus on those things, right? And those things can actually become have their own sections as subheaders. We'll get to that as we go through a little bit, but so let what your study is about guide the structure of the lit review. Okay, so let's start off with the components, the introduction. This is not a long section, right? It's just like any other introduction in any other chapter. You want to reorient the reader, right? You want to orient the reader about what's going on in the chapter, maybe how it's organized. So it's always helpful to restate the purpose of your study. It just gets, it just kind of refocuses things. Also, since this is the lit review, remind the reader of the importance of your study or why your study is needed. And if you want, you can also preview contents of the chapter that are to come. Again, if your school has any other requirements, of course, include those, but this is a good general kind of way to proceed for the introduction. You don't need to go on and on in the introduction. It's just the introduction. You're just kind of, again, orienting the reader to why your study is important, what the purpose is, and what's going to what's coming in the chapter. A page, less than a page. Okay. Next, again, check your template, but usually there's some kind of section. Sometimes it's called literature search strategy. Sometimes it's called methods of searching. But basically what this is a section that describes your how you search for materials for the lit review, how you search for research. So the idea is that you want to, your lit review should be comprehensive, which means it should, it should cast a net that that gets all or most of the research on your topic. And that can be, further pared down by things like dates, right? You might not need to go back years and years and years. But anyway, you want to have a comprehensive lit review, right? And so one way to show that you have a comprehensive lit review to your professors is in the literature search strategy, right? You're going to describe your search strategy, and it's going to tell them the databases you search, the search terms you use, so you can show them, yeah, here's the steps that I went about to get the material that I got, and it should kind of, basically show them that you conducted a comprehensive search. And so what do you do here? You describe, your search for research. You want to list any databases and search tools that you used. All the disciplines have their own kind of databases. You want to search the ones that are valid for your subject, list those. There's search tools like Google is a search tool. Google Scholar, is a search, and Google, but Google Scholar is a search tool that you can use. And it's a search tool that it's one of these search tools that searches multiple databases, right? So you get a lot of coverage that way. And there's also, if you go through your libraries, your school libraries, academic library, they're through their portal, they're going to have those kind of search tools too, like Academic Search Complete, Academic Search Premier. These are search tools that are in any standard academic library, university library, but they're also search tools that search from multiple databases. Okay. And you should be using, if we don't know, we need to make it clear that academic, you should be using university libraries, getting through your to the library through your school's portal, because it will have the scholarly material that you're looking for. Okay, you want, if sometimes your chair will say, hey, you need to look at a specific journal because it's important to your field of study. If you searched any specialized journals or specific journals, you want to include those. It's also important to include key terms and combinations of terms that you use for your search. And again, these are not going to be any surprise, right? These are going to correspond to what you're actually studying, your major concepts, your factors, your variables, maybe even your theories, right? So anything, that's in your research questions, those terms should appear here, and anything that's kind of related. And this last one's important. Any way that you filtered or qualified your search. So what does that mean? So in other words, when you're searching for material in the academic library, you can control your search, right? You can filter it, you can qualify it. Sometimes if you want it to just return English only articles to you, there's a button you can click for that. If you just want full text articles, there's a button you can click for that. But these last two are really important: date of publication and whether the articles are peer reviewed. Now, the gold standard for what you want to include in the lit review are peer reviewed articles. I mean, that's mostly what you want to focus on. Books, it's okay to include books sparingly. Usually they like you to go with the peer-reviewed journal articles. Sometimes you can use material from websites, but use it sparingly and only for kind of informational purposes. Like if you need a statistic or something, maybe from a website like a .org or a .gov website. I mean, that's fine, but you're not reviewing the material on websites. So stay focused on studies and articles that are peer reviewed. How do you know if an article is peer reviewed? Usually the library we use, when you conduct a search, there's a box you can click that says just return peer reviewed material. And I think most libraries would have that. And also when you see the information that pops up on an article, it will usually tell you if it's peer reviewed. The other qualifier, date of publication. This is kind of up to your chair and up to your school. Sometimes your school will have requirements about the date of publication material that's included in the lit review. In other words, there's some schools that want very recent material, right? Published within 5 years of the time you're going to graduate. So say you're going to graduate in 2023. They want most of the material to be from 2018 until now. I mean, you can use older material in those cases, especially if something is foundational, right? If it's an older study, but it's really important, it's still important to the field. In those cases, you would want to use, predominantly what they're asking for. Some schools, you can go back 10 years. Some schools don't have any requirements. You can use older studies, as many as you want. But just realize that if there is some kind of requirement that your school is asking for is in terms of the publication dates. If they are asking for material that's 5 years or more recent, make sure you include that in this description of your search strategy, that you predominantly included material that was in that range. Okay, and there's a general argument for this too, being that your study is being conducted at a certain point in time. Older research may, but usually, unless it's foundational, most, what happened 20 years ago usually isn't all that important to what you're studying now. Again, it might be in a historical sense or in a foundational sense, but you want a snapshot of current research, right? Of what's going on in your topic. So that's kind of a general argument too, to keep things recent. But again, always check your school's requirements. Okay, so the next, again, I'm going to say this a lot in this presentation, check your school requirements or the template. Sometimes the theoretical framework appears in this location in chapter 2. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it appears in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Sometimes it appears in just chapter 1. Sometimes it appears in just chapter 2. Most of the time it appears in chapter 1. You talk about it a little bit in chapter 1, and then you give it a more in-depth treatment in chapter 2. That's pretty standard. But again, there are differences about the location of the theoretical framework. So when you present it here, it would be much like you presented in chapter 1. There's just more elaboration on it. You know, the chapter 1's kind of a blueprint. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's why I'm going to do it. Here's how I'm going to do it. Here's a theory I'm going to use, and you talk a little bit about it. And here you're going to flesh it out more. So it's the same kind of, put it here in the chapter 2. Similar moves that you're going to make in chapter 1. Who developed the theory? What year? What did they develop it for? Theories help explain things, help explain phenomenon. So what did the researcher develop the theory to explain? Define the theory. It's important that you define it. Talk about what it is, what it means, along with any associated components. Sometimes these theories and the scales that are used that are associated with the theories, you know, they're measuring components. So the theories will actually have components to them. If you're using any of those components, you want to mention those and define those as well. You want to discuss a little bit what researchers have used the theory for. And it's important to connect to your study, right? Explain how the theory is going to help guide your study and how it connects to what you're doing. Maybe we should take a few minutes here just to discuss what the theoretical framework is and how it differs from, usually this discussion is in chapter 1, but since we're here, we'll talk about it here too. And it's different, and and how it's different from what they call a conceptual framework, right? So the theoretical framework is basically your theory or theories that you're going to use that's going to help guide your study. It's going to help explain your results. If you're doing a quantitative study, for example, say you're doing a study on emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. Those are just two things that pop into my head. So basically, your theoretical framework would be composed of a theory of transformational leadership and a theory of emotional intelligence, right? These theories will serve as a theoretical framework for this study. So I have to say something like that. Then to go into each one separately, right? Define each one separately, and do the things that we talked about here on the slide. And together, those two theories would make up your theoretical framework. Now, something important to keep in mind with the theoretical framework and with the theories, especially in a quant study, is that make sure your theory aligns with your instrument. Okay, instruments don't spring from nowhere, right? They all have theoretical foundations, right? So if you've chosen, let's say you're studying emotional intelligence, there's several instruments to study emotional intelligence, right? So you're going to choose one that you're going to that best suits what you're looking for. Say you choose Goleman's theory of instrument to study your emotional intelligence. Okay, well, if you use Goleman's instrument, you want to use Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence. You don't want to use Goleman's instrument and use like Jones's theory, right? Because their theories, it's the same, it's both emotional intelligence, but the theories are going to be a little different. They might also contain different components, right? And so Goleman's theory is going to measure certain components about emotional intelligence. His theory is going to talk about those components, whereas Jones's theory may not have those exact same components, or his take on emotional intelligence is going to be a little different. Hence, what his instrument measures is going to be a little different. So make sure that your theory it matches with your instrument. So if you're using Goleman's instrument, use Goleman's theory. All right. Conceptual framework. All this really still applies, except that usually conceptual frameworks are usually associated with qualitative studies. So theoretical frameworks typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks typically associated with qualitative studies. Quantitative studies typically proceed deductively, meaning there's a general premise or general theory, and then you collect specific data, and that general premise will help to explain that specific data deductively. So that's why theories work. Theoretical framework works for quantitative studies. Qualitative studies proceed largely inductively. That means that you're not going to proceed from a general theory. You're going to get your data, right? Your interview, if you're qualitative, you're doing interviews, you get, responses. You're going to kind of let that data speak for itself, so to speak. I mean, it's, themes are going to emerge from when you code the data. So this is inductive, and then you're going to make conclusions based on that specific data, right? So it works a little different than quant. So you don't need like a theory, an overarching theory from the beginning to give you theoretical premises, because you want the data to kind of, you want the conclusions to come from the data and not vice versa. So that's why you would use a conceptual framework. So you're not using theories, you're using concepts. But the same idea applies. You're just going to pick a concept that aligns very closely to what you're doing, define it based on the literature, and then talk about how it connects to your study. The conceptual framework in qualitative studies also helps guide your interview questions, right? Because when you sit down to write your interview questions, they don't come from nowhere either, right? Or just from your own brain. They should come from the research, and they should come from whatever concept you're using from the literature in your conceptual framework. I know that's a lot. We do cover this more in chapter 1. So if you're interested in more on this, and there are resources on the topic, and let me see if I can. We do have blogs on theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks. So if you want to check our websites for that. And there, we do have a blog on what the differences between the two are. Okay. Yes, thank you. It's in the chat box right now. Great. Next comes the review of the literature, right? And this is the bulk of the literature review. This is like 80% of it. And this is where you want to cover, right? You're digging into the studies, the research on your topic, right? And you are you're going to organize it based on what you're looking at, right? So it's tied very closely to what you're doing, your variables, right? Your major concepts. You can even use those things as your subheaders, right? So you're going to have some kind of organizational strategy, because you're going to have, at least 20 pages, and it can't be a solid mass of text. That's not writer friendly. That's not reader friendly. So the best thing to do is section it out by what you're doing, the things that you're looking at, right? So you want to cover the recent literature on your factors, your variables, your major concepts. Use headers based on these to organize the material into sections. Usually, once you have a section, within that section, organize the material. So you typically start by some kind of a section introduction, where you define the concept that you're looking at, that you're discussing, as you will be using it in your study. And then you can review the research on that, right? And you're going to want to make points based on the research. And you're going to be looking at things from the research like what kind of study it is, who were the participants, how were data analyzed, what were the findings, right? These are some of the details you want to pull from the studies and discuss. And reviewing the research at this level consists of synthesis and analysis. And let's go over both of these things. Synthesis is pretty easy to understand, right? It just means bringing different things together to make a whole. So this is the idea that you want to combine information from studies to make your points, synthesize, and your professors are going to tell you this too. Synthesis. I'm looking for synthesis. So the easiest, the easiest place to synthesize is at the paragraph level, and we're going to talk a little bit about paragraphing, just as a kind of a refresher, because when we get into lit review and we're kind of have so much information, and I said organization is going to be a challenge. Obviously one way to organize things is to put things into sections like we just talked about based on what you're doing, what you're looking at. But also think about the paragraph level, right? I mean, this goes back to what we learned in, I don't know when we learned it, middle school. Where you have a topic sentence and then you have evidence that supports or illustrates that topic. And then you have a summary sentence or sentence that transitions to the next paragraph. Okay. Because it's easy to lose sight of this kind of fundamental level of organization when you're kind of awash in a lot of research. So let's see what this looks like. Synthesis. Here's an example, bringing in details from the research. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but whoops, let's see. So the topic sentence here is highlighted in yellow. All the evidence that supports or discusses the topic is highlighted in green. Not all of it's highlighted in green, but we have the beginning and end. And then the summary statement is highlighted in teal. Just a couple of things I want to bring up to you in this. So we have the topic. Research has mostly shown that healthy literacy is an important factor in diabetic self-control and positive outcomes. Okay, we have the word mostly in there, which is going to be important in a few minutes. And so what we have in the green here is several studies, one by Anders, one by Gregory, one by Talbot. And it brings in details of these studies and the findings that illustrate the topic. Okay. And if you notice I guess it's 1, 2, 3, 4, it's about the fourth or fifth sentence from the bottom. It says, unlike Anders et al. And Gregory et al., Phillips found no statistically significant relationship between diabetic knowledge and glycemic control, which they attributed to a small sample size and possibly errors associated with self-reported instruments. Okay, so that's where that word mostly in the topic sentence comes into play. There's a little bit of analysis in here, right? So we have most research supports the topic, but here's one that doesn't. Right. So mostly, that's where the mostly comes in. And here's where the analysis comes in, which they attributed to a small sample size and possibly errors associated with self-reported instruments. Okay, so there is some explanation for the difference in findings. And then in your summary statement, something like empirical evidence from recent research, largely, there's that word, that qualifying word, right? Because most of it does, but not all of it. So largely is that qualifying term that signifies that. So this is an example of kind of what they're looking for when they're talking about synthesizing information to make points. Okay. And also, if you hear something like the meal plan, if you've heard that, but professor will say, use the meal plan, use the meal plan. What's the meal plan? I think it stands for main idea, evidence, analysis, and lead in or something. But it's a paragraph organizational structure, which is much like this, what I'm showing you now. Okay, analysis, and we know what this means. So the lit review, again, is not just a summary, right? You're going to want to do a couple things. Bring up, like we did here, shortcomings of the studies, right? Whoops, sorry. Any shortcomings of the studies, right? Any weaknesses. And anywhere too that you can kind of analyze some of the findings and show what what they're not covering and what your study is designed to cover. So, where you can, remind the reader that, hey, this is what my study is focusing on. This study focused on A, B, and C, but it didn't focus on D, right? So because remember, you're making that, it's kind of culminating into that argument for why your study is needed and for what other research in the lit review is addressing and not addressing. Okay. So yeah, analysis involves noting shortcomings or gaps of studies. You want to note trends in studies too, as well as gaps. Research sometimes goes in trends. And wherever you can, reiterate the research problem and the need for your study where you can, like I was just saying. And again, the whole thing kind of culminates in an argument for conducting your study. And usually, it just depends on your rubric for your school. Some schools may have some extra required sections in there. Sometimes there's a section called methodological review or review of methodological literature, which is kind of then you kind of summarize some of the major methods of the studies you reviewed and help make a case for your own. But just check your template for sure. But usually the summary comes next. Like any summary, recap the major points from the chapter. And in this particular case, in the lit review summary, remind the reader of what the research problem is based, again, what is in the literature and what's not in the literature. Remember, you're going to keep kind of highlighting that, what the literature is not focusing on to highlight, the need for your study. And reiterate the need for your study. Also want to helpful tools, put these two sites on your radar. One is called Research Rabbit, one is called Connected Papers. Basically, they're web-based platforms. I think Research Rabbit is free. I think Connected Papers you may need to pay for, but you'll need to double check that. They're web-based platforms to help you with the research process and which can help you with the lit review. They're kind of conceptual maps. And I'm not going to kind of give you a tutorial on them because the tutorials they have on the websites are far superior than what I could do here. They're basically, it's a visual representation of, they're like ideas are clustered and you can move them around and you can see how ideas and studies themselves fit. Great, yeah, and the website is right there in the chat box for you. You can see how your ideas and some of these studies relate to one another. So it can help you kind of organize your lit review. In these, yeah, so check these out if you think that they can be helpful for you. All right. And you can save, articles in these. When you come back to it, it'll be there, saved. So that's helpful too. All right. Okay. Again, this is who we are. We're a full service dissertation consulting company. We help with statistics. We help with editing. We help with content editing. We help with PowerPoints, with chapters. So if you want to find out more, please book a consultation just to see, again, no obligation, free. And that's our contact information. And I think that's it. Okay, I'll leave that up. Any questions? Let's just turn this over now to a question and answer session. If you have any questions, type them in the question and answer box, and I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yeah, somebody's got their hands raised. Just if you could just type your question in the question and answer box. or in the chat box, either one. Okay, here I have a question here. Do you need, let's see, okay, hold on. Do you need to include numbers of articles found and those that were appropriate? Some schools want that. Not always. Sometimes I would check with your school's template, and that would be if they want you to include the number of articles found and those that were appropriate, like you found, let's say, 80, and then on a further search, only 60 were usable. Yeah, that information, it's not always necessary, but it can be helpful. And you would put that in the literature search strategy section. All right. Here's another one. I'm developing my own theory. So how do I go about supporting that? Oof. That's kind of a different kind of a question. Are you talking about doing a grounded study, which is one that you kind of develop a theory from the study, or developing your own theory? Because theory development is it's kind of a big thing. I don't have an answer to that, really, or short answer. So, yeah, that's big, and it's usually done by advanced researchers. What is your opinion on using review articles in your literature review? Review articles, do you mean the ones that are kind of like a review of a book or an article, but they also kind of are an article as well? I say if it, review articles, maybe if it has something valuable and if it's peer reviewed, yeah, but they're typically not studies themselves. So I'd say you could use them, but I'd use them sparingly. Okay, is there a rule of thumb on the number of articles minimum in general, or an indication of when you have likely exhausted your search? Some schools give you, they want 40 articles. You got to have 40 articles or something, or they'll give you some number. There's no real set general number. But again, your school might require a certain number of articles, or an indication of when you likely exhausted your search. Yeah, I mean, if you start getting, when your searches, if you start seeing the same articles again, that you've been seeing, I mean, that's a good indication that you've exhausted your search. I mean, if you've used all your search terms and different combinations and you start seeing the same stuff, that's a pretty good indication that you've reached, you've exhausted your search. Okay. In the literature review for proposal, is it advisable to list journals articles that you want to use for presentation? I'm not sure what that means. For presentation, I'm not sure what you mean. You really just want to review the material that's on your topic, right? That helps inform, your topic and what you're doing, and shows the previous research that's been conducted. So I'm not sure what you mean about use for presentation. Okay, any more questions, or any ones that I didn't really answer that you want to come back to? Okay, well, great, everybody. Thank you for attending. Use your resources, use our resources on the website. Another thing, a very important resource to remember is your reference librarians at your school library, and usually you can have online help or just a chat with them. And don't feel weird about it. It's part of their job responsibility to help people with searches. So use your reference librarians. They will be a big help in your searches. Great, everybody. Thank you for attending. And remember, we do have other webinars on different things, methodology, different chapters. So check our webinar schedule and check our archives. All right, you're welcome, everybody. Thank you. Take care. Have a good day.